First of all, thanks everyone for attending. Today we have with us Andrew Bernstein. Andy is a philosopher and a writer of fiction and non-fiction. His latest non-fiction book is, normally I would hold it, but I'm not at home, so I can't hold it, but probably Andy can hold it. Heroes, Legends, Champions, Why Heroism Matters.
I always forget to have a copy, but here it is.
Yeah, that's good. And as you're probably already bored hearing me saying that, but it's a book that I was reading during the first week of the lockdown when everything was dark and gloomy, and it was fuel for the soul. It's changed my attitude, and it's a book that will make you see things on a way more optimist view. But today we are here to discuss the famous essay of Ayn Rand, Philosophy, Who Needs It. It's an essay. It was a speech delivered to a military academy in 1974, and according to many people, we can discuss whether it was probably the best public appearance by Ayn Rand, but we can discuss all this later. So I'll give the floor to Andy. The way we're going to run this is Andy makes a short introduction, then we have some questions, but after the introduction, anyone can jump in with any question or comment. And your comments could be either in the essay itself or on the issue of whether we need philosophy, why we need it, and maybe bring some cases or some specifics where it has worked for you and whether the lessons, let's say, from this speech/essay was useful to you. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sotirakopoulos. Yeah, I've been working on that name. You know, I think I'm getting it. But,
yeah, you got that. That was good.
All right, good. Thank you. But you know, Ayn Rand, of course, raises this question. This was a brilliant talk she gave at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point to I think in 1974 to the graduating class, you know, of future U.S. Army officers. And her answer, of course, to the question is, well, who needs philosophy? All human beings do. We all do. The rational animal needs philosophy as a means of understanding the world and guiding our life. Now, philosophy deals with the major questions of human life. For example, what is the nature of the universe taken as a whole? That's the question of metaphysics. What is human nature? There's the question of the metaphysical nature of man. What is the good? What's right? What's wrong? What's good? What's evil? What should we do? What should we not do? There's the moral or ethical question. What's the good society? You know, the question of politics, which is the application of ethics to social issues. And then, of course, the central and most fundamental question of philosophy: how do we know? You know, by what means do we gain knowledge? So and of course the question of aesthetics, and regarding the nature of art, because I'll hold that in abeyance for purpose of this discussion, unless somebody wants to bring it up, because it's a very technical field, and I'm certainly not love art, but I'm not an expert in the field of aesthetics. But anyhow, so why? I mean, to my students generally are majoring in business or some more practical concern. They have to take philosophy classes to fill out, you know, their requirements. And, you know, some of them are good students. They're interested, but some of them, understandably, will ask, you know, it's a good question. You know, I'm going to, you know, be working in the business world. Why do I need to study all these abstract questions, right? That's a fair question. And I think, you know, here are some of the answers I'll give. Let me start with a story. Right? I was just a kid from Brooklyn, right? So, you know, start with a story, and we pull the principle out. You know, by 20 years ago, no, it was like more like 25 years ago. You know, I was working. You know, I still do a lot for the Ayn Rand Institute, but I was doing a certain task for the Ayn Rand Institute back then. I used to represent ARI at the National Council of Teachers of English, the NCTE convention every year to promote the Fountainhead Essay Contest. And one guy, so they got all these English teachers there. And one guy comes up and his eyes light up. He was all excited. He said, "There's a Fountainhead Essay Contest." He was really positive about it. I said, "Yeah, sir, are you familiar with the Fountainhead?" And he said, "Am I familiar with the Fountainhead? The Fountainhead changed my life." So he proceeds to tell me the story that when he was a high school kid, he wanted to go to college and study, English and be an English teacher. His parents, understandably, were concerned. Well, you're not going to make any money. You're a smart kid. Go to medical school. So he went along with his parents, and he was studying pre-med in college, and he was just terribly bored. It's medicine, obviously a great field, but it wasn't the field he loved. He told me. Then I read The Fountainhead. He said, and I said, "Oh my God, I'm on the path to being Peter Keating. I'm just conforming like Keating did to his mom. I'm giving up my passions, my values, in order to satisfy, my family." And he said he switched his major to literature, and he got his degree in literature, and now he's an English teacher. And I said to him, were your parents right that you wouldn't make any money? And he said, yes. He said, yes, they're right about that. But of course, the more importantly is he's filling his life with what he loves. His career is now, filled with passion, not with ennui. And so there's a profound question of moral philosophy there in that example, right? Is it morally right for me to pursue my own happiness, or am I morally obligated to sacrifice myself for my family or significant others? Now, this is a complex question. It takes moral philosophy to answer that question. I think when we answer the question for people who honestly want to know, why do all people need philosophy, it makes sense to use moral examples, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where that's where philosophic principles really, come down, make contact at sea level, and in William James' term, have a great deal of cash value in our life. But the more abstract questions also have great impact in my life. What kind of world do we live in? The question of metaphysics. Well, I'm going to have a very different philosophy and a very different life if I live consistently with my philosophy, if I answer the question by saying a world which is created and governed by an all-powerful God who demands obedience from me, as distinct from a naturalistic, secular world where human beings are a natural development in a natural world. Because if I take the religious view and live consistently by it, then of course that of course is so intimately related to the corollary epistemological question. How do I gain knowledge? Because if I'm consistent to religion, it's by faith. I have to start with the revealed text, and I have to take its teachings on faith. Whereas if I'm consistent with a naturalistic rather than a supernaturalistic metaphysics, then the answer to that question is, I start with observation, and then I think logically about observational evidence. And so those two together, supernaturalism and faith, supernaturalism in metaphysics and faith in epistemology, or naturalism in metaphysics and reason in epistemology, they're going to have an enormous difference in my life. So let me just wrap this up. So let me beat on religion for a second, because the consistent application of religion is the Middle East today, where Islam is simply the dominant philosophy, or the Middle Ages and Dark Ages in Western history, where the Catholic Church was dominant, or the 16th century Reformation, in Northern Europe, where the Protestant religion was dominant, or ancient Judea, where Orthodox Judaism was dominant. But what they have in common, of course, is reason is. What did Martin Luther put it nicely? Reason is the devil's harlot. One thing you can say about Luther, he didn't mince words, right? Sometimes translated into English as reason is the devil's whore, And you remember who Luther thought were the three most grievous enemies of Christianity in order? The devil, the Pope, and Aristotle. So you get from his premises, that faith and faith alone justifies mankind. That's understandable. But culturally, you're going to get, if that philosophy is put into practice consistently, you're going to suppress reason, rational human beings as heretics, and you're going to subsist in some kind of dark age. If you're living in a free country, like relatively free country like we are today, and you take that consistently. I won't mention any names. I'll sign off. I'll finish with this because I know a very intelligent young couple. They were both students at MIT, top, science technology school, one of the best in the world. They were both devout Catholics, deeply in love. They were engaged. They sleep together. They couldn't have sex because, that's sinful. So I can imagine, I don't even want to think about it, the torment of that. I said sleep together. I doubt they did much sleeping because, if you're like Dominique Franken in those, granite quarry scenes in the Fountainhead, and you're in love, and the man or woman you love is in your arms, but you can't make love, the sexual tension, the frustration, is just, you can't sleep. And I've always said religion is hazardous to your health. And there's just one example, and a more grievous example, of course, of these faith healing denominations where the kid has diabetes and they won't seek medical intervention. They'll pray and pray and pray, and of course the child will die. So, which is against the law, I think, in the United States today, thank God. But religion is hazardous to your health, and if you take a religious philosophy seriously and try and live by it seriously, you're going to undermine your chance of happiness or even life. So what philosophy or what philosophic principles we accept and live by have life and death importance in our lives. I can go on for a long time, but you get the idea.
So thanks for that introduction. Sorry, let me fix something here. All right. So I want to bring up 2 points, and I invite also the audience to bring up whatever points they want. But the first point has to do with the context of the speech itself. And the second is the role that the speech plays when teaching objectivism for people like ourselves who are interested in making sure that these ideas go further. So the mere idea that you have a philosopher going to speak to a military academy today would be almost unbelievable. And that's what makes one of the things that make Rand so special, that she can go and talk to people who are not experts on the topic, who probably have not much background in philosophy, and not only she managed to capture them, but she produces one of her best essays, one of her most famous essays. Now, just imagine for a second if someone like, who are the most famous philosophers today or of the last years? Imagine Michel Foucault or Judith Butler or Slavoj Žižek going to speak to a military academy. People will be...
John Rawls. Rawls would put you to sleep.
Yeah. Imagine these well-celebrated philosophers going to speak to normal people, so to speak, right? The result would be a disaster. So that's the first thing that is for me so interesting in this essay. The other interesting thing is that Rand's strongest point was not public speaking, right? And normally she would write an essay and read it. So from what we know today, where public speaking has become, let's say, a technique of its own, that's not considered a good kind of thing. However, this particular essay, I think, works very well also as a talk. So I think, in my opinion, it's the best public appearance of Ayn Rand. And I encourage people, if they want to go deeper, Leonard Peikoff, in one of his courses, I think it's the one on writing or on effective communication, something like that, analyzes the speech and explains why this speech is so successful. And the third thing I want your comment on is, how does this speech operate within the objectivist movement? So for me, if you tell me you're going to have a class of kids for, let's say, 4 lessons on objectivism, I always start with philosophy who needs it, because it's a very good intro to metaphysics and epistemology. And also it's so good, specifically the opening with the aliens. It's so catchy, it's so good, that I think this essay basically offers great value also to the objectivist movement in terms of approaching new people, because she's doing a great job in selling not her philosophy, but first and foremost philosophy itself. So any comment by you or the audience on these issues would be interesting.
Well, I mean, the essay is brilliant. That's why I think Leonard Peikoff is right when he says Ayn Rand wasn't just a great philosopher. She was a great salesman or saleswoman of philosophy. Maybe the greatest in history. Showing in terms accessible to intelligent every man and every woman just why philosophy is indispensable for all of us. I always tell my kids, my students, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, whatever profession you're going into, you're a human being. And a human being needs, I think the best way to really make it clear to somebody is they need a moral code, like in the example of that English teacher. It's a good example. Do we have to sacrifice for our family or can we live for ourselves? And, some of my students come from, various countries where arranged marriages are still a thing. And when we discuss this issue, I could see in some cases their eyes light up. It's like, wow, there's a whole moral issue here. That there are philosophers who believe I have a right to pursue my own happiness, that I don't have to surrender my values, my hopes, my dreams, my aspirations to meet the beliefs or demands of my family. So the idea that philosophy is indispensable for all human beings. I mean, Ayn Rand is right, and she establishes that claim brilliantly in this essay.
And another thing that has two things that have caught my attention in this essay as well. The one is where she talks about the bad people, and she says that actually you also need to read also the Bad Philosopher. So so basically the context is he tells the soldiers, look, I understand if you are completely indifferent to what passes for philosophy today. Because to be honest, at least 30 years ago, what was passing for philosophy was a guy with, a scarf saying things that no one could understand. I think today it's even worse. Today, what passes for philosophy is someone telling you that you should feel guilty either for existing because you pollute the planet, or for being a man, or for being white, or for being a Westerner, or whatever. So Rand says, I understand if you feel this revulsion for philosophy, and yet you shouldn't abandon the field. And at some levels, she says you should engage. And she says, it's bad, but you don't know why it's bad. Now, that always struck me as a bit interesting. So does this mean, Andy, that we should go, for example, and read Judith Butler? By the way, I've tried, it's unreadable. Or try to read Guattari and Deleuze, or read White Fragility, or this kind of stuff. Should someone take one for the team and go and read them so that we know what's happening here? Or people should have, let's say, first-hand experience of evil philosophies?
Well, in answer to your question, Nikos, Ayn Rand made a nice distinction between philosophy for Ragnar and philosophy for Reardon. Now, you remember, in Atlas Shrugged, Ragnar was preparing to be a professional philosopher. That was his field. Whereas Reardon, of course, is a businessman. So Ragnar Donnerskold as a and I think we could probably say it more broadly than a professional philosopher, to include humanities intellectuals in your field, Nikos, or in history and in literature and sociology and philosophy, in the humanity, maybe psychology, in the humanities and social sciences, the man-centered disciplines. And I think, the Ragnars, they need to study the influential philosophers. And in many cases, I mentioned John Rawls before, of course, in the past, 1970s, 1980s, very influential moral philosopher at Harvard University. The Theory of Justice is widely read. Unfortunately, it has a real impact. So if you're a professional intellectual, you have to read that and try to struggle through Foucault or Derrida, stuff like, which is just, it's rationally unintelligible, but you need to have an understanding of it. Now, for philosophy for Reardon, I don't think Ayn Rand means, and I certainly don't think it's reasonable to expect, Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs when he was alive, or some, I can't mention Bill Gates anymore. He's He's so hated by so many people. But the Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who created Microsoft, were brilliantly productive business people. Is it reasonable to expect them to read Kant, Hegel, and the 20th century and 21st century offspring of this? Only if they have a passion for it. They don't need they don't need philosophy at that depth to run their to run their business or live their lives rationally. But they should certainly read Ayn Rand. They should certainly study the philosophy that studies reality, the Aristotles, the John Locke's, the Ayn Rands. So they have, philosophy to rationally guide them. I don't think they need to refute Kant and Hegel, but they need to be able to understand reality and, and lead their lives in a rational manner. So I think it's a very good distinction that Ayn Rand makes between philosophy for Ragnar and philosophy for Ridden.
Before we go to Joseph, I'll add one comment here. I get what you say. I would make one distinction. Today, we are in our environments, we will probably be invited soon in workshops where they're going to talk to us about our white fragility and these kind of books. I would make an exception. I would encourage all these books that people, when the woke brigade is telling you, educate yourself. These kind of books, I think you should indeed educate yourself and read them, because they're so bad that the only hope they have is that people don't actually know the evil in these books. So, for example, a book that has won multiple awards and is being taught in business workshops that should educate you about race, and in which book the author, for example, says that I could not feel pity about in the ruins of 9/11 because this represented white America, I think we should spend some time and see what is the evil in the thing that passes today for the philosophy that if you don't get it, you are, quote, non-educated. But I have some more questions, but let's go to a question from the audience. Joseph, unmute yourself.
Yep. So I heard somebody talk, it's a little bit different, but I'll get back, bring it in. There was somebody trying to figure out how to find counterfeit currency before they had the automatic machines and stuff like that. And the way that they did that is they spent a lot of time with real currency. So when they came across fake ones, then it was easier for them to detect. So they did not spend a lot of time on fake currency. And I'm kind of thinking like that with philosophy too. As I'm getting more into the objectivist epistemology and I'm looking at reality, whenever people are doing floating abstraction, it's like that is a foreign land to me. You got to bring it down to the evidence, right? And as I'm getting more and more familiar with that, I think it's getting less and less important. I don't know if this is correct, but that is my assumption. Less and less important to understand all these complete madness philosophies. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree, Joseph. I hear what you're saying, Nikos, and I think familiar. For instance, if this was 1930s and we were girding ourselves to fight National Socialism, that you're reading Mein Kampf, reading Hitler's book would have some value. But it'd be, I think, of vastly more value to understand classical liberalism, principles of individual rights, the Lockean Jeffersonian tradition here. To know what the good is, I think, gives us much more ability to identify the evil. So if we're going to go into the workshops of the woke, actually that's the left co-opts to itself all these terms they have no right to. Like liberal. They're not liberals, they're statists. We're liberals, supporters of liberty. They're not woke. The idea of being woke to the evils of the white man or whatever. They're still in their dogmatic leftist slumbers. They're living in that delusional Marxist universe. We need to read Atlas Shrugged. That's the antidote to the poison. We need the antidote to the poison much more than we need to really know the poison. I mean, it's good to know both, but I think that's for professional intellectuals more than for more than for everyday business people or everyday people. But this idea that I can't feel compassion or pity in the ruins of 9/11 because this is retribution for white America. I mean, one of the premises there is that there's collective guilt, that there's racial guilt. Even aside from, we look at the glories of Western civilization, even aside from that fact, there's no such thing as collective guilt or collective responsibility. And I think reading Ayn Rand would enable us to identify that. So even if my ancestors had, were slave owners, which given that they were, so persecuted on the shtetl in Eastern Europe, I doubt that they owned any slaves. But even if my ancestors were slave owners, that does not redound on me. I have no responsibility for that. I'm not responsible for it. And so the individualism of Atlas Shrugged would show us that the idea of collective guilt or racial guilt is a chimera. It's just false. It's Marx famously called religion the opiate of the masses, or the opiate of the people. Well, be that as it may, Marxism is the hallucinogen of the intellectuals. Marxism is the hallucinogen of the intellectuals. They live in this delusional world, and I think where white people are guilty for the sins of their ancestors. I wonder why, if there's collective responsibility, I wonder why white people don't get any credit for the great achievements of their ancestors. For Aristotle and Newton and Beethoven and Mozart and Shakespeare and Edison. How come they don't get any credit?
Well, today there was an article whether Aristotle should be cancelled. Luckily, the author comes towards the answer that no, he should not. But my claim would be, if you cancel Aristotle, you're not allowed to use the law of identity. And by the way, if we go with cultural appropriation, I forbid everyone who is not Greek from using the law of causality, because then you are appropriating my culture. Anyway, shall we go to Brian's question? Brian, unmute yourself.
My question is, and I don't know how good of a question this is, but what, if anything, would you say to somebody who takes the attitude of, well, what's wrong with being compartmentalized? Why do I have to have a consistent philosophy? Compartmentalization works for all these successful people. So that seems to be the successful thing. Why can't I just be pragmatist? Why do I need to be integrated? Why can't I just go with reason in my career, for example, and then my emotions in my morality or part of the time?
Not only is this not a bad question, I think that's a brilliant question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Go ahead, Nikos.
All right, so I will start with some real life examples. Let's take Steve Jobs, who was definitely compartmentalized. You could say that this maybe did not, we don't know if it really cost his life. But if you read his biography, for example, how he treated his early stages of cancer, or how he dealt with his diet, these things, some of his beliefs which were not based on the use of his mind and had to do mostly with his spiritual philosophy and all that, literally almost cost him his life. We don't know if it eventually cost his life, but in a way it did. So I would turn the question to someone and tell him, show me someone who, because he's compartmentalized, he's better off. So I can show you people, for example, my favorite examples are football managers, right? Or basketball managers. They can process so many information, they're so rational on the field, and when they go outside of the field, they open their mouth, and it's like, oh my God, that's like, how can a clever person make so stupid political comments? Stupid in my opinion. So yes, many people are compartmentalized, and this might not cost their life. So not everyone pays these mistakes the way Steve Jobs pays them. But I challenge people to show me one person who was compartmentalized, and this compartmentalization makes them better off as if they were consistent. And I can see this also for myself, right? So I allow small things that I know are wrong, most of which is the occasional cigarette. Now, I know it's wrong, I can rationalize why it's okay, but it doesn't make me better off. Or the times that I'm emotionalist or a bit tribalistic with my country, for example, and my bonding with Greece, that's not to my best interest. So yes, people are compartmentalized. Some of them are very successful, but I don't see this necessarily. No, actually, I definitely don't see this as a recipe. I think they're successful despite being compartmentalized, if that makes sense. Andy, and then we'll go back to Brian to see.
Yeah, I think
his
no,
thoughts.
I think Steve Jobs is a good example, Nikos, because he had that part of his philosophy was of Eastern mysticism, and that was the way he approached his cancer, rather than embracing Western medicine and the state-of-the-art tech cancer treatment that he certainly could afford. So it may well have contributed to his early demise. But at a lesser level, that example I started out with of those MIT students who were very, very intelligent, and in their education and their career, they're very rational, but they're going to go by faith in their personal life, and you see the results. It leads to misery, pain, lack of sleep, and if they really carry that forth, consistently in their life, then they're gonna live in accordance with faith-based beliefs. I mean, what does that mean? Are they going to turn to faith healing, for example, and things like that? It'll cost them or their child their lives. So I think the principle here is, reason and a rational philosophy is akin to nutritious food. Well, the antipode to that, unreason, anti-reason, and an irrational philosophy is akin to poison. And the question becomes then, why would you want to mix some poison in, even a small amount? Why would you want to mix some poison in a nutritious meal? It can't lead to flourishing life. It could only lead to illness and or death.
And also, I think compartmentalization is very well dramatized in Rand's novels. So think, for example, of Atlas Shrugged. And if you haven't read the book, close your ears, because it's going to be a light spoiler. What happens to Hank Rearden, who I think is the example of a compartmentalized personality? For the biggest part of his life, he's actually deeply unhappy, in his personal life at least, which is an important thing. And because of his double moral code, at some point, he almost loses everything. He loses the woman that he loves. He loses his Rearden medal, and at some point, I don't want to say what happens in part 3, but bad things happen, and he's saved by someone who is not as compartmentalized as he is. So, Brian, have you got any comments on this? It was a great question, but I would also want to take your view on that.
It sounds like it actually relates to the questions of what actually is the standard of value. Like how are you judging, by what standard are you judging success? And if it's your own self-interest and what benefits you, then how do you determine what's actually in your self-interest? So these are the kinds of things that people haven't really thought about, or they're not understanding.
Yes, and defining this is very difficult. So I would accept, for example, that Steve Jobs was actually happy having read his biography. I don't know if he was happy, but he was really, really seriously into the spirituality stuff, and he considered it an inherent part of his success. However, again, the objective result, the actual result of this, unfortunately, is shown by history. And it was that this part was not good for him. And again, we can give examples of people, for example, who drink a lot or who do things that are not good. Does it make them feel good on the short term? Yes, but this is not the same as saying it's good for you. And you raised a very important question. How can you actually tell what is good for you? Well, the easy answer is to give you like the line, which is, oh, whatever is kind of helps you in flourishing and living qua human being. Actually taking this point and concretizing it to I should do this thing specifically is very difficult. Like I have some personal decisions to take, and it's so difficult. Even like, should I live in this city or in that city? And there are all these things that come into play. Oh, there's this person that is important to me there, or this small thing here. So clearing your mind and saying what is really good for me and by what standards. I mean, if this was a pill, I would pay a lot of money for that pill, because it's very, 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 very difficult. And unfortunately, no one can do it for us. We have to do it ourselves.
Yeah, and Nikos, that also presupposes that the person even thinks in those terms, in terms of what's in my rational self-interest. That's already a great advance. That's already, plunging into philosophy, studying philosophy, thinking about philosophy, and identifying a rational, life-giving moral principle. That's already to be advanced in this field. A lot of people don't think in those terms, and/or just uncritically accept some iteration of the self-sacrifice code that they're taught by the church, by religion or the state when they're growing up.
Or the worst of this, which says if you suffer, there's something good at it, which again, it's so inherent in many Christian cultures. I don't know if it's specifically Greece and the Orthodox culture, but I'm sure it's also with the Catholics, and not only. So it's very, very easy to follow this. And actually, when you find yourself in a dichotomy in life where you could take either of these roads, you can do the most rich thing, which says, well, I'll do the difficult part because it's the thing that won't make me happy. Therefore, it's a good thing. And then basically you throw your life away. Anyway, hopefully on a more positive note than throwing our life away, Bob, unmute yourself and come forward.
Come forward like that.
Well, I mean, with your question, yeah.
Come forth.
I guess I want to make a point that there is an extent to compartmentalization, and there is an extent to happiness, and they go hand in hand. I've been having some philosophic discussions with recently reconnected cousins, also in their 70s. And the one I'm thinking of right now is a lawyer, but he has faith. But let me get back to the point of this. We had a fairly long discussion, and I'm not trying to disabuse him of his faith, but I'm trying to get him to see that there is a difference between reason and faith. And we've had several long exchanges on that. They're on my Facebook page if anybody's interested. And at last I got to a point where I thought it was just obvious that he couldn't disagree on this. And instead of answering, he made a joke and neglected what I had said. Now, I don't think of him as on the extent of happiness and on the extent of compartmentalization. I don't think he's tremendously compartmentalized, and therefore I don't think he's tremendously unhappy. By all external appearances, he has a fairly happy life. But he would be happier if he could break down the compartments. That's the point I wanted to make.
I couldn't agree more, because you can find many people that because of their virtues, they have achieved things in life, and they can have all sorts of irrational ideas or premises. They might be, I know a lot of people, specifically in Greece, where being a Marxist is completely different than what it means elsewhere, which, it had this kind of working class tradition, and the idea was that you're the hardworking person, you care about virtues such as productivity, and you take care of your family, and you're like the leader and all that stuff. And they are happy, but it's despite their ideas, not because their ideas. And the same with religious people, right? I think it's exactly what Bob said, that probably these people would be even happier if it weren't for these things. And you can see this, for example, with some football players who were huge talents, and they achieved a lot of things, but because of some irrational thing, they didn't become even better. And compare them, for example, with Cristiano Ronaldo, who works like crazy and all that stuff, and in his mid-30s, he's a candidate for best ever. So you could say, yeah, George Best was drinking and partying, all that stuff, and he was good. Yes, but he was good despite his drinking and his partying and all that stuff. Andy, sorry, I brought football, and culturally, it's not the big in the US, but.
Well, I become much more of a football fan recently, Nikos, and cheering on the U.S. ladies to win the World Cup, even though they're all a bunch of leftists who show no interest in studying basic economics, whatsoever, and coming to realize what would enable women athletes to make equal pay as male athletes. But it's a good example. There's so many people who are very successful in their careers. Sports are filled with them. I'm thinking in terms of American sports, people like Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, Joe Namath. These guys were big partiers, and they're Hall of Fame players. But they come to the ballpark the next morning still hungover from the night before. They would have done better. Had they of course been clean livers. And this is true in any field. So I think that's a very good example. There was a I won't mention it. I don't remember his name, but he was an art surgeon, and very good at what he did. But he was also an alcoholic, and dealing with people's lives every day at work. You might want to make sure you're completely sober. You'd be even better that way. So again, like I said, mixing in even a small element of irrational, life-harming elements into a generous portion of rational, life-giving or life-promoting elements doesn't make sense. Why would you want to mix in even a little bit of rat poison into the nutritious banquet? It can only serve illness and death. It can't serve flourishing life. Well, you me if you let me use an Aristotelian concept, Nikos.
Now, having said that, though, I want to say something more. I think we should avoid the trap of being here rationalistic. So there's a very good chance that my life would be better had at some point smoke a couple of more cigarettes, which means I would be a bit more relaxed and not guilt-ridden. And maybe someone, for example, who is a miser or who is antisocial, or he wants to do something but says, today I'm supposed to, do 16 hours of work. There's a very good chance that if that night he went out, maybe his life would be better. So I think these things are also contextual. So we know, for example, of authors who took drugs. Now, you could say that if that person had an issue and these were prescribed by a doctor, and if this actually helped them stay awake, and while staying awake, they wrote. So everything is within a context. So I don't want to say that there is this kind of a list of the things that if you do, it means that you're compartmentalized. I think it's objective, but also contextual if it makes sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. But there are distinctions here. We talked about mixing in poison with the nutritious meal. There are some things that are toxic but can be used in moderation. Alcohol, marijuana, I think tobacco. If you smoke a couple of cigarettes a day, and then you take, because you enjoy them, and then you take steps to, offset whatever harm that little bit of tobacco does. You drink water, you take vitamin C, you exercise, you eat a lot of vegetables and stuff. You get a good night's sleep. A glass of wine or beer or two a day for an active person. This is marijuana, from what I hear, in moderation. These are not so toxic. They're not like, cocaine or crack or heroin where they're so toxic. There are people who die from very small number of usages. They're too toxic for there to be any moderation. So yeah, there's that principle. It's definitely contextual. But the idea of entertainment is not. That's a need. That's a necessity. Somebody who tries to work 16 hours a day and sleep 8 hours a day, I don't think they're going to be as happy as if they take days off and go to the beach, go to the movies, go hiking in the hills or whatever it is that's fun. It refuels the soul. And I think that's, somebody asked me once in class, because I was teaching a whole bunch of classes this semester, and I've written a bunch of books, and somebody asked me, how do you write all these books when you're teaching so many classes? And I said, well, I don't waste time. And they took that to mean, she said to me, but if you don't relax and have fun and go to the movies or watch TV, you're gonna get burned out. I said to her, listen to what I'm saying. I said, I don't waste time. Do you assess entertainment as wasting your time? Because I certainly don't. I think entertainment is very important. It's very high on my list of priorities, and I get a lot more work done when I take time off to watch movies or go to the ball game, or go to the beach or whatever. I spend fun time with my daughter. I get a lot more work done when I take time off to entertain than if I try and work 7 days a week.
Makes sense. John.
Evening. It was a question about philosophy in academic fields, and not philosophy as a subject, but dealing with it in academia. So hopefully you can both provide some insight. So in my day-to-day life, I like to think I try and integrate Ayn Rand's philosophy and can use reason to solve problems. But I'm also doing a degree part-time, and I'm finishing my third, or coming into my final year, and I need to write a dissertation. And I'm thinking of doing it along the lines of free speech in English law. So law is the subject which I'll be looking at, but you can't really answer that question, or at least in my head, without delving philosophically into the meaning of free speech and why it provides some value and should be protected by the law. So from a reasons perspective, I have in my head how I'm going to approach the possible question and do the research, and can do that quite methodically. But I wonder if you can provide any advice as to how to perhaps engage on a philosophical level without necessarily leaving marks for overly quoting Ayn Rand, because that's never something good with lecturers nowadays, but trying to get them to, or I tend to find seminars and lectures that topics, the topic of law or any other subject, isn't necessarily integrated with philosophy or academia more broadly. So it's quite, I would have thought that question around free speech in law would be quite difficult to answer without engaging it. But how do I actually get the lecturers to understand or appreciate those links?
Can I ask one question, John? Are you in a UK university?
Yes, Birkbeck, which is rather on the left-wing side of things.
Yeah, I know. Zizek was there, Alex Douzinas was there. Yeah. Okay, so here's how I would approach it. So at some point when you write an essay or a dissertation, you have to provide a theoretical prism. So I wouldn't have it, the whole thing being objectivist. But here's what I would do. I would say my standard, my prism here, because you need to provide a definition of what is free speech. And I would say there are various definitions here and there, but I would choose, for example, the definition of free speech and censorship as given by Tara Smith in her Free Speech Vernacular article. And then I would take various pro-free speech views, which are not objectivist. I would take people like Frank Furedi, Joanna Williams, these kind of people, right? So I have an umbrella of ideas for free speech, and the prism through which I see it is the objectivist theory, because you have to explain why. And you explain, you say, this, in my opinion, is the most principled approach of free speech. I'm not telling you if it's good or right, but I have to take a principled definition. And you will notice that a lot of the free speech fighters do not offer a principled defense of free speech. They say, for example, it's good because it makes a better public sphere. So you say, I'm trying to find an approach which ticks these boxes. And this is the objectivist approach. So unless the professor is an unprofessional zealot, they can't tell you anything. Because as it happens to be, the objectivist perspective offers the best and the most principled defense of free speech. because it tells you exactly what is free speech and what is censorship. And I would definitely encourage you to check that article by Tara Smith. If you don't know what I'm talking about, drop me an email and I'll send it to you. Luckily, it's not behind the paywall and it's free. So in this way, I'm using objectivism in my academic work not to, let's say, hold the party line or to take one for the team, but because it is a useful tool, because it helps me in a way that no other tool can help me. Andy.
I think that's a good point, Nikos. I think one way to approach this is I'm not arguing for this. I'm not being dogmatic or doctrinaire. I'm not saying this is true. I'm simply saying this is one way we can look at this. This is one perspective on the issue that we should consider. And then, then you could bring in Ayn Rand and point out, on Rand's view, this, human intelligence is mankind's survival instrument. So that not only enables us, in the way that wings are for a bird and foot speed is for antelopes and stuff, and that not only, and claws and fangs for lions, that not only enables us to deal with nature, and learn how to grow crops and cure diseases and build homes and cities and stuff, but it enables us to deal with human beings. And since the mind is mankind's tool of survival, we need freedom of intellectual expression. We need to be able to to state what's on our mind. And if we put out ideas that are irrational or evil, then the way to deal with that is not to bring legal charges against somebody or incarcerate them, much less execute them. It's to combat them with more rational ideas, and you have an intellectual debate where freedom of man's mind means freedom of mankind's instrument of survival, which means we'll make many more advances than if we try to suppress people whose ideas are unpopular or whose ideas even are irrational. And I think you could give a whole bunch of examples that your professors, might relate to. Charles Darwin, for example. What would happen to him under ISIS or under the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages? Or Einstein, why do you have to leave National Socialist Germany? You can bring up all kinds of examples like that, where freedom of speech means freedom of intellectual expression, and it's enormously important in advancing human knowledge and human life. I think there's many examples. If you're familiar with Will Durant's magisterial story, 11-volume story of civilization, I think it's volume 4, which is The Age of Faith. And the chapter in there, the Adventure of Reason. Nice title, isn't it? The Adventure of Reason. So you have all these budding, Aristotelians, in the 12th and 13th centuries that Nikos wants to cancel now because they weren't Greek. But all these budding Aristotelians, who are reasoning and studying Greek philosophy and studying Aristotle and challenging the church. And some of them were condemned. Some of them were burned. Some of their books were burned. Durant's right. The reason in the 13th century, 12th and 13th century was an adventure. It was dangerous to challenge the church. But great minds like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas will triumph and study Aristotle, teach Aristotle, write on Aristotle. And it was those courageous minds embracing Aristotle who were responsible for the medieval Renaissance. So there's any number of examples you could use of how human life is enormously benefited by accepting and standing up for the principle, freedom of intellectual expression.
And one last comment on this. By the way, I'm continuously muting people because there's background noise. I'm not doing it as kind of an authoritarian chair. But one last thing, John, a huge problem on the free speech issue. We're going slightly off topic, but I'm going to close the parenthesis in a second. A huge problem is that there is a lot of confusion with definitions. So for example, say, oh, Twitter is censoring me. So again, a reason why you should use Tara Smith's article and the objectivist point of view is it's the only one that clearly defines what is free speech and what is censorship. I've read almost everything that is out there for free speech because I used it for the chapter of my hopefully upcoming book. There's nothing which is as good as, and I'm not saying this on a tribal objectivist way. It is the best approach. Right. Now, unless we have any other question, I have a last question for Andy. And this is about how we apply. So at some point, let's say we reach a point where we read again and again, and we say we have conquered, let's say, philosophy. We've understood the basics of objectivism, hopefully, and all that stuff. And yet, we see that there is a lag between understanding something and applying it in action. So, for example, you have understood, let's say, the nature of values, the nature of sex, and you've understood this discussion between Francisco and Hank Rearden on sex, which is one of the best parts in Atlas Shrugged. By the way, we discuss it in that web meetup of ARI Europe. I encourage people to go watch it. It was brilliant. And yet you find yourself, or I find myself, doing things that are not in accordance with this philosophy. And then you realize, why did I do this? I had the theory. Why didn't I apply it? Why did I make this mistake? Whereas I knew exactly what was happening. Why is there this time lag? And you have to experience something to realize your mistake, rather than when you first read it and understand it when you see it on paper, or even more, when you see it dramatized, let's say, in a novel.
Yeah, you reminded me, Nikos, as a friend of mine who's a clinical psychologist. I remember he once said to me, change is often graceless. It lacks grace or gracefulness. I think there often is a time lag, and perhaps the older we are, the more misintegrated we are, and the more we have to undo. It's certainly very helpful. I mean, I know kids, teenagers or in their 20s, who were raised by really good objectivist parents. And not just that they were objectivists, but they were really good objectivist parents. And that is, they explain. First of all, you give the kid a lot of love. There's a lot of quality time with the child. Now, you don't need objectivism to understand that, but reasoning with the child, explaining to the child rather than being dogmatic, rather than taking an anything goes approach. Let the kid do whatever he wants. And there's certain rules, certain guidelines, certain principles. They're based in reality. Here's the reasons. And you reason with the kid, but this has to be done. But we'll give you the reasons, and so on and so forth. And these kids seem to me to be very, happy. They're very psychologically healthy kids, and so they may not have a lot of mistaken stuff in their subconscious or conscious minds that they need to undo as they move forward. But for some of the rest of us, who grew up in not such healthy families in this sick world. Actually, I don't want to say a sick world. There's still a lot of great things in the world, but a world that has a lot of mental illness and irrationality. We may have learned growing up a lot of errors, and if we come to objectivism in our 30s or 40s, we may have a lot of stuff, a lot of mistakes that we need to undo, and that could take a lot of work, and it's a heroic undertaking. I'm going to salute somebody who undertakes to change. They throw off their religious upbringing. They come from a leftist college training, whatever, and they're working to undo all of the errors and the problems that cause. I give them a lot of credit. But yeah, I think that could be a long process of moral and psychological retraining. It could take a long time. The benefits of it, of course, of what we've been discussing, holding a rational philosophy and living by it consistently.
And actually, I think it was in that beautiful scene, that heartbreaking but beautiful scene, where Hank Rearden tells to Dagny, he knows it's over, spoiler, he knows it's over, but he tells her, I'm not sad because now I have the knowledge. I know that I'm going to pay dearly my mistakes, but at least I have the joy that now I've understood, and now in a way I'm free. He's not free because he's not free of the outcome, but there's a clean slate in front of him and he can move on. Joseph, have you also done mistakes which you now see in a different eye with philosophy, or is it something else?
Oh, Joseph has never made any mistakes, Nikos. Didn't you know that?
Oh, I'm making so many mistakes. I'm making many mistakes every single day. I think that's why I keep a steep learning curve as well.
As long as we
And-
learn from those mistakes. You haven't made a mistake of where you are right now on the beach in Tahiti. Living large. Good for you, Joseph.
Yeah. I was thinking about the time lag thing. I agree with what you, Andy, said there. I think also that my experience has been that I need to integrate the new understanding into across the board, right? Because each concept, it has an effect on all the other things. So this new understanding has to be integrated across the board, right? And that simply takes a lot of time to do that. And then you bounce up. So you accepted this new thing that you just learned, and then you're bouncing up against some old habit. And now you need to reconfigure that, right? And that needs to be done across the board. And so it's just simply a lot of work, and it takes time. So that's my comment on the lag.
It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes courage, you know, and it's a heroic undertaking. And I want to say again, you know, I don't think it was accidental. I think Nikos wants to cancel you, Joseph. He's a Philist.
No, actually, it's what it's, and I've heard this many times also in business and in like self-development and stuff. It's just that when it comes to your own life, it's really annoying because like the theory in philosophy, it's not like nuclear physics, right? It's not so complicated what you have to do when you see it in retrospect. And yet, I don't know if it's the baggage, as you said, Andy, or as Joseph said, it's basically the normal learning curve, but it happens. So, right. Have we got any other comments, or shall I throw the last comment and then we call it a day? So, when I listen to this lecture, I put myself quite often on the position of the audience. So I say, okay, what if I'm like a military trainee, and now I'm listening to this, and I would imagine them enjoying it tremendously, but I would imagine them jumping from their seats in one point. And it's where it says that you have, quote, you have chosen to risk your lives for the defense of this country. I will not insult you by saying that you're dedicated to selfless service. It is not a virtue in my morality. And then she explains that the defense of one country is in your selfish interest. So quite often with military people that I admire, and they're now in leadership and self-development like David Goggins or Jocko Willink, this is the thing that always annoys me, that they keep using the term, we do sacrifice and all that stuff. So Rand goes there and says, it's an insult to you if I tell you that what you do is self-sacrifice. So to finish how we started, that's another reason why I think this is a brilliant speech. And I would say it's the best public appearance of Rand, because it also has this shock factor that it tells you that even you who go and not probably, but there's a chance that you're gonna die or you're gonna get serious injury, that's still selfless. So it's kind of the best, how do they call it in a TV episode, like a hook. Like, oh, I'm not gonna tell you much about my philosophy, but keep in mind that in my philosophy, what you're doing is not selfless. And actually, it's an insult to you if I tell you which is selfless. So just brilliant. Andy, any parting words before we say goodbye?
Well, philosophy is the science of understanding reality, as a whole, as distinct from the special sciences. You know, those characteristics that apply to everything. You know, is the universe created, or is it eternal? Is it made out of matter? Is it made out of spirit? You know, those things that apply to everything as a whole. And I think we can point out to people: do you think understanding the nature of the world that we live in and the nature of human beings and their place in that world might be a benefit to your life? And I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. A lot of people tell you when they're being honest, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I want out of life. I don't know where I'm going, what I want to do. And I think studying philosophy can be enormously helpful to figuring out who I am you know, as a human being, and what it is that I want to do with my life. So yeah, I think philosophy, who needs it? Ayn Rand's answer is everybody. She's absolutely right.
And my parting words would be, specifically those of you who are not so lucky as to have discovered objectivism early in life, do a thought experiment. Try to think how you would approach a date, your work, or your family before you discovered objectivism. So what I found is that when I switched my politics and my philosophy, almost everything in my life changed. The reason I see everything. And Peikoff says in that documentary, which you can only find a small part on the internet, I think it's called In His Own Words or something like that. Anyway, it's like the biography of Peikoff on a DVD. He says something like, I'm paraphrasing obviously, after the first time he met Ayn Rand, even the way he washed his hands, he saw a difference and he thought the difference. So he realized, and this is basically philosophy we need, even the way in which you wash your hands could be influenced by philosophy. So I encourage people to do this kind of introspective exercise. And this, in my view, is the best proof of what a huge role philosophy plays in your life. How you do things in your romantic or professional life differently when you're under the auspices or under the influence of different philosophy. Anyway, many thanks, Andy. It's always a pleasure. It's impossible to have a discussion with you on anything which is not good fun. I mean, we could have a meetup like the weather tomorrow in New Zealand, and I'm sure we could be talking about it for an hour. Many thanks also to the audience. Very, very good questions that we have things to process. Specifically, the one on compartmentalization was, you know, was anyway, very good stuff. So thanks everyone, and see you in future Ayn Rand Center UK events. Actually, we get value from Ayn Rand Center UK and the work of Razi and the people around him. So support, like, share in social media, support the center, support the daily show, support the meetups, and I will see you all in a future event. All the best. Bye-bye.
Nikos, vaya con Dios.
Thank you. Bye-bye.